Chapter 11. At the appointed time I returned to Miss Havisham's, and my hesitating ring at the gate brought out Estella. She locked it after admitting me, as she had done before, and again preceded me into the dark passage where her candle stood. She took it, but taking no notice of me, looked over her shoulder, superciliously saying, "You are to come this way today," and took me to quite another part of the house. The passage was a long one, and seemed to pervade the whole square basement of the manor house. We traversed but one side of the square, however, and at the end of which she stopped, put her candle down, and opened a door. Here the daylight reappeared, and I found myself in a small paved courtyard, the opposite side of which was formed by a detached dwelling house that looked as if it had once belonged to the manager or head clerk of the extinct brewery. There was a clock in the outer wall of the house, like the clock in Miss Havisham's room, and like Miss Havisham's watch, it had stopped at 20 minutes to 9. We went in at the door, which stood open, into a gloomy room with a low ceiling on the ground floor at the back. There was some company in the room, and Estella said to me as she joined it, "You are to go and stand there, boy, until you are wanted." There being the window, I crossed to it and stood there, in a very uncomfortable state of mind, looking out. It opened to the ground, and looked into a most miserable corner of the neglected garden, upon a rank ruin of cabbage stalks, and one box tree that had been clipped round long ago, like a pudding, and had a new growth at the top of it, out of shape and of a different colour, as if that part of the pudding had stuck to the saucepan and got burnt. This was my homely thought as I contemplated the box tree. There had been some light snow overnight, and it lay nowhere else to my knowledge, but it had not quite melted from the cold shadow of this bit of the garden, and the wind caught it up in little eddies and threw it at the window as if it was pelting me for coming there. I divined that my coming had stopped the conversation in the room, and that its occupants were looking at me. I could see nothing of the room except the shining of the fire in the window glass, but I stiffened in all my joints with the unconscious knowledge that I was under close inspection. There were 3 ladies in the room and 1 gentleman. Before I had been standing at the window 5 minutes, they somehow conveyed to me that they were all toadies and humbugs, but that each of them pretended not to know that the others were toadies and humbugs, because the admission that he or she did know it would have made him or her out to be a toady or a humbug. They all had a listless and dreary air of waiting somebody's pleasure, and the most talkative of the ladies had to speak quite rigidly to express a yawn. This lady, whose name was Camilla, very much reminded me of my sister, with the difference that she was older and, as I found when I caught sight of her, of a blunter cast of features. Indeed, when I knew her better, I began to think it was a mercy she had any features at all, so very blank and high was the dead wall of her face. "Poor soul," said this lady, with an abruptness of manner quite like my sister's. "Nobody's enemy but his own." "It would be much more commendable to be somebody else's enemy," said the gentleman. "Far more natural." "Come, Raymond," observed the other lady, "we are to love one another." "Sarah Pocket," returned Raymond, "if a man is not his own neighbour, who is?" Miss Pocket laughed, and Camilla laughed, and said, checking a yawn, "Oh, the idea!" but I thought it seemed too good an idea. The other lady, who had not yet spoken, said gravely and emphatically, "Very true." "Poor soul," Camilla presently went on. I knew that they'd all been looking at me in the meantime. "He's so very strange. Would anyone believe that when Tom's wife died, he actually couldn't be induced to see the importance of the children's having the deepest trimmings to their mourning? 'Good Lord,' says he, 'Camilla, what can it signify so long as the poor bereaved little things are in black?' So like Matthew, the idea." "Good points in him, good points in him." "Oh yes, you may well say that, Cousin Raymond," returned Camilla. Raymond replied, "Heaven forbid I should deny the good points in him, but he never had and he never will have any sense of the proprieties." "You know, I was obliged," said Camilla, "I was obliged to be firm. I said, 'It will not do for the credit of the family.' I told him that with deep trimmings, without deep trimmings, the family would be disgraced. I cried about it from breakfast to dinner. I injured my digestion, and at last he flung out in his violent way and said with a D, 'Then do as you like.' Thank goodness, it will always be a consolation to me that I know I instantly went out in the pouring rain and brought the things." "He paid for them, did he not?" asked Estelle. "It's not a question, my dear child, of who paid for them," returned Camilla. "I bought them, and I shall often think, when I wake up in the night, and had a peaceful sense that I bought them." The ringing of a distant bell, combined with the echoing of some cry or call along the passage by which I had come, interrupted the conversation and caused Estella to say to me, "Now, boy." On my turning round, they all looked at me with the utmost contempt, and as I went out I heard Sarah Pocket say, "Well, I'm sure! What next?" And Camilla added with indignation, "Was there ever such a fancy? The idea!" As we were going with our candle along the passage, Estella stopped of a sudden, and facing round, she said in her taunting manner, with her face quite close to mine, "Well?" "Well, miss," I answered, almost falling over her and checking myself. She stood looking at me, and of course I stood looking at her. "Am I pretty?" "Yes, I think you're very pretty." "And insulting?" "Not so much as you were last time," said I. "Not so much so?" "No." She fired when she asked the last question, and she slapped my face with such force as she had when I answered it. "Now," she said, "you little coarse monster, what do you think of me now?" "I shall not tell you." "Because you are going to tell upstairs, is that it?" "No," said I, "that's not it." "Why don't you cry again, you little wretch?" "Because I shall never cry for you again," said I. Which was, I suppose, as false a declaration as ever was made. For I was inwardly crying for her then, and I know not what of the pain she cost me afterwards. We went on our way upstairs after this episode, and as we were going up, we met a gentleman groping his way down. "Whom have we here?" asked the gentleman, stopping and looking at me. "A boy," said Estella. He was a burly man of an exceedingly dark complexion, with an exceedingly large head and a corresponding large hand. He took my chin in his large hand and turned up my face to have a look at me by the light of the candle. He was prematurely bald on the top of his head and had bushy black eyebrows that wouldn't lie down, but stood up bristling. His eyes were set very deep in his head and were disagreeably sharp and suspicious. He had a large watch chain and strong black dots where his beard and whiskers would have been if he had let them. He was nothing to me, and I could have no foresight then but that he ever would be anything to me. But it happened that I had this opportunity of observing him well. "Boy of the neighbourhood, eh?" said he. "Yes, sir," said I. "How do you come here?" "Miss Havisham sent for me, sir," I explained.
"Well, behave yourself. I have a pretty large experience of boys, and you're a bad set of fellows. Never mind," said he, biting the side of his great forefinger as he frowned. "You behave yourself." With these words he released me, which I was glad of, for his hand smelt of scented soap, and he went his way downstairs. I wondered whether he could be a doctor, but no, I thought, he couldn't be a doctor, or he would have been quieter or more persuasive in his manner. There was not much time to consider the subject, for we were soon in Miss Havisham's room, where she and everything else were just as I'd left them. Estella left me standing near the door, and I stood there until Miss Havisham cast her eyes upon me from the dressing table. "So," she said, without being startled or surprised, "the days have worn away, have they?" "Yes, ma'am. Today is—"
There,
with the impatient movement of her fingers.
I don't want to know.
"Are you ready to play?" I was obliged to answer in some confusion. "I don't think I am, ma'am." "Not at cards again?" she demanded, with a searching look. "Oh, yes, ma'am, I could do that if I was wanted." "Since this house strikes you as old and grave, boy," said Miss Havisham impatiently, "and you are unwilling to play, are you unwilling to work?" I could answer this inquiry with a better heart that I had been able to find for the former question, and I said I was quite willing.
"Then go into the opposite room,"
said she, pointing at the door behind me with her withered hand, "and wait there." I crossed the staircase landing and entered the room she indicated. From that room, too, the light was completely excluded, and it had an airless smell that was oppressive. A fire had been lately kindled in the damp old-fashioned grate, and it was more disposed to go out than to burn up, and the reluctant smoke which hung in the room seemed colder than the clearer air. It was just like our own marsh mist. Certain wintry branches of candles on the high chimney-piece faintly lighted the chamber, or it would have been more expressive to say faintly troubled its darkness. It was spacious, and I dare say that it had once been handsome, but every discernible thing in it was covered with dust and mould and dropping to pieces. The most prominent object was a long table with a tablecloth spread upon it, as if a feast had been in preparation when the house and the clocks all stopped together. A centrepiece of some kind was in the middle. It was so heavily overhung with cobwebs that its form was quite indistinguishable, and as I looked away along the yellow expanse of which I remember it seemed to grow like black fungus, I saw speckled spiders with blotchy bodies running home to it and running out of it, as if some circumstances of the greatest public importance had just transpired in the spider community. I heard the mice, too, rattling behind the panels, as if the same occurrence were important also to their interests. But the black beetles took no notice of the agitation and groped about the hearth in a ponderous, elderly way, as if they were short-sighted and hard of hearing and not on terms with one another. These crawling things had fascinated my attention, and I was watching them from a distance when Miss Havisham laid a hand on my shoulder. In her other hand she had a crutch-headed stick on which she leant, and she looked like the witch of the place. "This," said she, pointing to the long table with her stick, "this is where I will be laid when I am dead. They shall come and look at me here." With some vague misgiving that she might get up upon the table there and then and die at once, the complete realization of the ghastly waxwork at the fire, I fair shrank at her touch. "What do you think this is?" she asked me, pointing with her stick. "That where all the cobwebs are. What do you think it is?" "I can't guess what it is, Ma'am." "It's a great cake, a bride cake, mine." She looked all around the room in a glaring manner, and then stared, leaning on me, while her hand twitched my shoulder. "Come, come, come, walk me, walk me." I made out from this that the work I had to do was to walk Miss Havisham round and round the room. Accordingly I started at once, and she leaned upon my shoulder, and we went away at a pace that might have been in imitation, founded upon my first impulse under the roof, of Mr. Pumblechook's chaise cart. She was not physically strong, and after a little while said, "Slower." Still we went with an impatient, fitful speed, and as we went she twitched the hand upon my shoulder and worked her mouth, and led me to believe that we were going fast because her thoughts went fast. After a while she said, "Call Estella." So I went out on the landing and roared that name as I had done on the previous occasion. When her light appeared, I returned to Miss Havisham, and we started away again, round and round the room. If only Estella had come to be a spectator at our proceedings, I should have felt sufficiently discontented. But as she brought with her the 3 ladies and the gentleman whom I had seen below, I didn't know what to do. In my politeness, I would have stopped, but Miss Havisham twitched my shoulder, and we posted on with a shamefaced consciousness on my part that they would think that it was all my doing. "Dear Miss Havisham," said Miss Sarah Pocket, "how well you look." "I do not," returned Miss Havisham. "I am yellow skin and bone." Camilla brightened when Miss Pocket met with this rebuff, and she murmured, as if plaintively contemplating Miss Havisham, "Poor dear soul, certainly not to be expected to look well. Poor thing, the idea." "And how are you?" said Miss Havisham to Camilla. As we were close to Camilla then, I would have stopped as a matter of course, only Miss Havisham wouldn't stop. We swept on, and I felt that I was highly obnoxious to Camilla. "Thank you, Miss Havisham," she returned. "I am as well as can be expected." "Why, what is the matter with you?" asked Miss Havisham with exceeding sharpness. "Nothing worth mentioning," replied Camilla. "I don't wish to make a display of my feelings, but I have habitually thought of you more in the night than I am equal to." "Then don't think of me," retorted Miss Havisham. "Very easily said," remarked Camilla, amiably repressing a sob with a hitch that came into her upper lip, and her tears overflowing. Raymond is a witness to what ginger and sal volatile I am obliged to take in the night. Raymond is a witness to the nervous jerkings I have in my legs. Jerkings and jerkings. However, they are nothing new to me when I think of the anxiety of those I love. If I could be less affectionate and sensitive, I should have a better digestion and an iron set of nerves. I'm sure I wish it could be so. But as to not thinking of you in the night,
The idea!
Here a burst of tears. Cousin Raymond, who I understood to be the gentleman present, and also I understood to be Mr. Camilla, came to the rescue at that point and said in a consolatory and complimentary voice, "Camilla, my dear, it is well known that your family feelings are gradually undermining you to the extent of making one of your legs shorter than the other." "I am aware," observed the grave lady, whose voice I had but once, "that to think of any person is to make a great claim upon that person, my dear." Sarah Pocket, whom I now saw to be a little dry, brown, corrugated old woman with a small face that might have been made of a walnut shell, and a large mouth with a cat's without the whiskers, supported this position by saying,
"No, indeed."
"Thinking is easy enough," said the grave lady.
"What is easier, you know?"
assented Miss Pocket.
"Yes, yes, yes,"
cried Camilla, whose fermenting feelings appeared to rise from her legs to her bosom.
"It's very true. It's a weakness to be so affectionate, but I can't help it. No doubt my health would be much better if it were otherwise. Still, I wouldn't change my disposition if I could. It's the cause of much suffering, but it's a consolation to know I possess it when I wake in the night." Here another burst of feeling. Miss Havisham and I never stopped all this time, but kept going round and round the room, now brushing against the skirts of the visitors, now giving them the whole length of the dismal chamber. "There's Matthew," said Camilla, "never mixing with any natural ties, never coming here to see how Miss Havisham is. I have taken to the sofa with my stay-lace cut, and I have lain there hours insensible, with my head over the side and my hair all down, and my feet I don't know where."
"Much higher than your head, my love," said Mr. Camilla.
"I've gone off into that state hours and hours on account of Matthew's strange and inexplicable conduct, and nobody has thanked me."
"Really, I must say, I should think not," interposed the grave lady.
"You see, my dear,"
added Miss Sarah Pocket, a blandly vicious personage,
"the question to put to yourself is, do you expect anyone to thank you, my dear?"
"Without expecting any thanks, or anything of the sort," resumed Camilla, "I have remained in that state hours and hours, and Raymond is a witness of the extent to which I have choked, and the total inefficiency of Ginger, and that I have been at the pianofortes, heard across the street where the poor mistaken children have supposed it to be a pigeon cooing in a distant dovecot, and now to be told—" Here Camilla put her hand to her throat and began to be quite chemical as to the formation of the new combinations there. When this same Matthew was mentioned, Miss Havisham stopped me and herself and stood looking at the speaker. The change had a great influence in bringing Camilla's chemistry to a sudden end.
"Matthew will come and see me at last," said Miss Havisham sternly. "When I'm laid on this table, that will be his place at my head, and yours will be there, and your husband's there, and Sarah Pocket's there, and Georgina's there. Now you all know where to take your stations when you come to feast on me. Now go."
At the mention of each name, she had struck the table with her stick in a new place, and now she said,
Walk me,"
and she went on.
"I suppose there's nothing to be done," exclaimed Camilla, "but comply and depart. It's something to have seen the subject of one's love and duty for even such a short time. I shall think of it with a melancholy satisfaction when I wake in the night. I wish Matthew could have that comfort, but he sets it at defiance. I am determined not to make a display of my feelings, but it's very hard to be told one wants to feast upon one's relations as if one was a giant, And to be told then to go? The bare idea!
Mr. Camilla interposing, as Mrs. Camilla laid her hand upon her heaving bosom, that lady assumed an unnatural fortitude of manner which I suppose to be expressive of an intention to drop and choke when out of view, and kissing her hand to Miss Havisham was escorted forth. Sarah Pocket and Georgiana contended who should remain at last. But Sarah was too knowing to be overcome, and ambled around Georgiana with great artful slipperiness, so that the latter was obliged to take precedence. Sarah Pocket then made a separate effort of departing, with
"God bless you, Miss Havisham, dear,"
and with a smile of forgiving pity on her walnut shell countenance for the weakness of the rest. While Estella was away lighting them down, Miss Havisham still walked with me, with her hand upon my shoulder, but more slowly. At last she stopped before the fire and said, muttering and looking at it for some seconds, "It's my birthday, Pip." I was going to wish her a happy birthday and many happy returns when she lifted her stick.
"I don't suffer it to be spoken of. I don't suffer those who were just here now, or anyone, to speak of it. They come here on that day, but they dare not refer to it."
Of course I made no further effort to refer to it. "On this day of the year, long before you were born, this heap of decay," stabbing herself with a crutched stick, and then at the pile of cobwebs on the table, but not touching it. "This decaying body was brought here. It and I have worn away together. The mice have gnawed at it, and sharper teeth than the teeth of mice have gnawed at me." She held the head of her stick against her heart as she was looking at the table. She had in her once white dress, now all yellow and withered. The once white cloth all yellow and withered, everything around in a state of crumble under a touch. Whether the ruin is complete, and when it is complete, I do not know," she said with a ghastly look. "But when they lay me dead in my bride's dress on the bride's table, which shall be done, and which shall be finished, the curse upon him, so much better if it was done this day." She stood looking at the table as if she was looking at her own figure lying there. I remained quiet. Estella returned, and she remained quiet also. It seemed to me that we continued thus for a long time, in the heavy air of the room and the heavy darkness that brooded in its remote corners. I even had an alarming fancy that Estella and I might presently wither to decay. At length, not coming out of her distraught state by degrees, but in an instant, Miss Havisham said, "Let me see you play cards. Why have you not begun?" With that we returned to her room and sat down as before. I was beggared as before, and again as before Miss Havisham watched us all the time, directing my attention to Estella's beauty, and made me notice it far more by trying her jewels on Estella's breast and hair. Estella, for her part, likewise treated me as before, except that she did not condescend to speak. When we had played some half a dozen games, the day was appointed for my return, and I was taken down into the yard to be fed in the former dog-like manner. And there, too, I was left again to wander about as I liked.